The devil all the time. Just a young man trying to protect his family and his loved ones from a town that is just riddled with corruption and brutality. No one can really be trusted. I thought the movie was good. I think the movie had a lot of potential. The movie gives you a lot to take in and a lot to think about, especially when it comes to the story and symbolism. Symbolism is a huge part of this movie, and you see it pretty much throughout the entire film. There is a lack of subcontext, especially with characters. There's 3 or 4 separate stories going on in this one movie, and even though they don't all seem connected as the movie goes along, by the end of the movie it all ties together at the end. And I do think that is a great thing. I think that is really cool, and I think they executed that very well. But there is 2 stories that involve a couple of characters that does end up intertwining with the overall plot that I do wish we got more of an explanation throughout the film on why they do what they do and what's made them do what they do. The movie opens up great with Bill Skarsgård remembering his time during World War II. I think one of the best scenes in the movie was when he was out in the field and he saw a man at the stake who looked like he was dead, but the closer he got up, his flesh was completely burned off and he was actually still alive. And he had to take his gun out and shoot him in the head just to end his misery right then and there instead of letting him suffer. I think that scene is fantastic because it really implements what this movie is going to be. It showed the brutality of what you are going to see for the next 2 hours, and it also showed you what type of person he would eventually turn into. After that, he returns home to Virginia with his family. Back in the 40s and 50s, I can only assume that any average family would be Catholic. They would be some sort of religious belief, Catholic, Christian. And you can really tell how his character struggles with the belief in God, considering what he saw when he was fighting World War II. That when he comes back home, it just doesn't feel right. He falls in love, he starts a family, he finds a home away from his parents. He has a little boy. As the beginning part of the film carries on, Willard, which is Bill Skarsgård's character, teaches his young son Arvin how to basically be a man, how to take care of himself, but most importantly how to take care of his family. And they go through multiple stages of showing how his brutality has somewhat taken over his future, and how he's taken what he saw from World War II and he's applying it to his everyday life just to ensure that his family is safe. But now he's finally regained his religious beliefs. When he figures out that his wife is dying, a lot of that comes into play because now he thinks that the only way to save his wife is to pray on it. Just as the first act of the movie is coming to an end and it's now going to transition into an older Arvin, which would end up being Tom Holland, Willard starts getting really blinded by the idea that someone he doesn't even really know could exist if God is really going to save his wife from cancer. Pushing the religious belief on his son Arvin and pressuring him to do things that, I mean, even as a young boy, you may not know what you believe in or not. It really affects Arvin's future in the movie, as you would eventually see throughout the 2-hour film. Where the symbolism comes in, and I thought it's the biggest piece of symbolism in the movie, and they played it off so well, is the man that Willard saw in World War II when he was put up at the stake because he was so desperate to save his wife. Willard himself grabs Arvin's dog and, well, you fill in the blanks. He sacrificed the dog, and it was a brutal scene. It was not pretty at all, but it shows what Willard, pushed to the brink, thought he literally had to do to ensure his wife's survival. And by the end of it, his wife ends up dying of cancer, and he ends up shooting himself in the head. I thought the hardships that were given to Arvin, which is once again Tom Holland, is really the making of a true hero type story, even if by the end of the movie he would never be looked as such by an authority standpoint. He suffered his entire life from when he was a kid even till now. After his father died, he ends up moving in with his uncle and his grandmother and another girl who ended up being the byproduct of a murderous religious cult as well. And you can really tell that his childhood has brought him to a point in his young adult life where he really believes he needs to do whatever he can to keep his family safe. But the one thing he refuses to do is take part in the religious beliefs. And understandably so, considering what you see him go through as a kid. He probably doesn't want anything to do with it, and if he does, he clearly doesn't like it. Robert Pattinson ends up entering the picture as the new priest of the town, or the reverend, I believe he is, and there's not too much of a backstory given to him. He comes in and he already looks like a scumbag. What I will give credit to Robert Pattinson for is the fact that he completely changed his voice. It's very high pitched. And what was really interesting that I found out is he refused to have a dialect coach to kind of teach him how to put on a 60s Virginia accent. No one heard his accent actually until his first day on set when he had a scene. So he kept it under wraps, he kept it very private, and I think he did a fantastic job with that. I think that's why he's such a great actor, is the fact that he can make his own decisions in the sense that he's very unique. It's very rare. You're never gonna get bored of his style. He's always gonna pull something new. You know, long story short, you find out this reverend is not just a scumbag, but he's a perv. He starts going around and trying to sleep with all the younger aged girls in town, and one of those girls being Arvin's stepsister. As the story develops on, he sleeps with her, he gets her pregnant. She approaches him about it, and the Reverend, Robert Pattinson, basically says, I never did anything, and I would suggest that you get rid of the baby. So in doing so, it was an accident, but Arvin's stepsister ends up killing herself. And in the first place, Arvin didn't really trust this reverend guy, and rightfully so. Just by seeing him for the first scene of the movie, you could already tell something was up. So now when he finds out that his sister was pregnant with the reverend's child, and what the reverend really drove his stepsister to do, it's only just gonna lead downhill from here, as if it wasn't already downhill from the beginning of the movie. Two other stories that happen in this film which are somewhat interesting, but the detail isn't really there. There's a lack of it. Jason Clarke, who plays a character named Carl, and Riley Keough, who plays a character named Sandy. Carl approaches Sandy almost as if he's like a model agent, and he basically tells her, like, from what I remember, he's interested in working with her, and obviously she is too. And as the movie goes on, because the movie's a huge span, it's like, I believe it's like a 20-year span or so, if not a little bit more, you end up finding out that as they're working together, they end up getting married, but they're serial killers. Carl and Sandy, they drive around the town and they pick up hitchhikers, and as they pick up hitchhikers, they ask where they're going, they'll bring them halfway, they'll stop in the woods, sometimes they'll have a picnic, sometimes they'll go for a swim, and as the day goes along, it's all kinds of sick antics. They'll take nude photos with each other and end up killing the hitchhiker. Carl will sometimes get the hitchhiker to have sex with Sandy, and then right after they'll kill the hitchhiker. Sometimes they'll bind in what seems to be torturing the hitchhiker, and then they'll kill the hitchhiker. I mean, nowadays when you hear of serial killers, you don't often hear of stuff happening like that now, but I think back in the 60s, hitchhiking was just such a big part of the time they lived in. Not everyone had a car, and if you had a car, well, that's amazing, but for back in the 60s, I think having a serial killer or a group of murderers like that, I think really worked. Why they were murderers, like why they were picking up hitchhikers and continuously keeping this serial killer streak going on throughout the entirety of the movie. I don't really know. I'm not too sure. There's not much detail there, and I kind of wish there was, but we didn't really get it. Then another part of the story, which is Sebastian Stan playing a character named Lee Bodecker. He's a sheriff. He's actually the man who was called in when Arvin's father shot himself. His story is interesting as well, with little detail to begin with. He is running for mayor or some type of political authority within the town they live in, but you don't know what got him to that point, and you also just don't really understand why he's doing it. You also find out that he kind of gets in with the wrong people, and I believe they're funding his political party. It's straightforward in the sense that he wants control. It's not straightforward in the sense of why, like what are the details, and that's something that just can't be answered because they don't really get into it in the movie. Another interesting part of the story is you find out he's the brother of Sandy, who is one of the serial killers picking up the hitchhikers and killing them. He does not like Carl at all. It shows in the movie multiple times. He does not trust Carl, he does not like Carl, but still at the same time, it does not seem like he fully knows what they're up to and what they really do. Why I like the third act of the movie so much is because Arvin is basically the one to tie all of these stories together. To begin the climax, Arvin does visit the Reverend. He wants to exact revenge on the Reverend because of what the Reverend did to his stepsister. They have like a 5-minute discussion. The Reverend knows what's coming to him. He knows he's gonna get killed. So Arvin does proceed to Ryan Robert Pattinson. Right after Arvin kills the Reverend, he is now on the run, and of course you could all see this coming. He decides to go hitchhiking, and as he goes hitchhiking, he gets picked up by Carl and Sandy. Now obviously, Arvin has no idea that these two are serial killers. So he hops in the car, he tells them where he needs to go. They say they're actually on their way to that particular area. But halfway through, Carl says he needs to take a piss. So they stop at the side of the road, they go into the forest, and he goes to the bathroom. Arvin already can feel like something isn't right. Carl tries to get Arvin out of the car. He's got his camera ready and he wants to take photos. As Carl got out of the car in the first place to go to the bathroom, Arvin saw he had a gun tucked into the back of his pants. Arvin took out his gun and he could already feel like Carl was gonna try something with him, so he shot Carl and he killed Carl.
Carl!
Sandy, on the other hand, she was at the steering wheel. She pulls out her weapon and she aims it at Arvin. Arvin clearly doesn't want to do this. Arvin is not a bad guy, and that's what the movie goes to show. He is not a bad kid. He is just thrown into a messy situation. He has been dealt a terrible hand, and he is just trying to find his way out of it. So they're both aiming at each other, and Sandy says sorry, but Arvin shoots first and ends up killing her. You do find out later on that Sandy had no choice in general, because Carl always had a fear that Sandy would eventually turn against her and just didn't want this life anymore. She didn't want to be a part of this serial murder, psychopathic life. You could already tell she was getting sick of it as the movie went on, and I mean, why you would even do it once is beyond me. To avoid any type of betrayal, Carl would always load her gun with blanks, so when she shot Arvin, nothing came out. So she was destined to lose from the beginning of that interaction. To wrap up the events of The Devil All the Time, Lee ends up getting called to a crime scene involving what would be his brother-in-law Carl and his sister Sandy, both murdered. The dots are connected quite quickly, and he starts to figure out that the Reverend and the murder of his sister and his sister's husband were both done by Arvin, a boy that he once met all those years ago when his own father took his life. Arvin goes back to his family house, not knowing what to do now since he's on the run from the authorities. Lee goes to Arvin's old family house and he starts searching in the the woods for Arvin. The point is to kill Arvin, and you must be asking yourself, well, why? Is it because he killed his sister? No, not necessarily. The point is just before Arvin left Sandy and Carl's vehicle, he found a bunch of Polaroids. And all of these Polaroids were consisting of hitchhikers they have previously killed. So Arvin has that Polaroid on him. Lee took the rest of the Polaroids that he could possibly find from his sister and he burned them all, because he knows that if the authorities get a hold of that, it's not only going to brand his sister as a murderer, but it's also going to taint his political run, and he can't have that happen. So as Lee hunts down Arvin, Arvin ends up getting the upper hand by having a sneak attack on him and shoots him right in the chest or the stomach. Either way. As Lee lays on the ground bleeding to death, Arvin basically tells him he had no choice, and really at the end of the day, Arvin was just defending himself. He takes the Polaroid he had and he shoves it into the pocket of Lee's jacket, and then Lee ends up dying. Arvin then ends up leaving what would later be a crime scene, and he once again goes hitchhiking. And I know you're probably thinking like that is a bad idea, and honestly back in that day, who knows, it probably was, but what else is he gonna do? He has no choice. So a guy picks him up and asks him where he's headed, and he has no idea, and as the guy starts to drive away, he starts to fall asleep in the car. And it shows you a quick montage of everything that has happened. It shows you the Reverend being found by the police, and it also shows you Lee being found by the police. And just as that scene ends, you find one of the police officers taking out the Polaroid in his jacket pocket, which would now connect the fact that his sister and Carl were in fact serial killers, and that would also go to taint Lee's name as well. By the very end of the movie, Arvin sits in the truck, yawning constantly, about to fall asleep, not knowing where his future will take him and not knowing what his life will hold in general. Overall, I thought the movie was good. I thought the dialogue was fantastic. Everyone put on a great Virginia accent. I do think that there are a lot of details that were missing. There's a lot of subtext that we could have gotten, and unfortunately we didn't. The beginning was fantastic with Bill Skarsgård, and the end was great with how it ended up tying everything in together. Although with certain characters, I do believe that character development could have been used a little bit more. Believe it or not, I actually just ran into the Reverend himself, Robert Pattinson. We were talking about the movie and I gave my opinion on it, and as we were talking, my accent kind of got into that southern kind of sound, and he told me that it was about a 7 out of 10, my accent. And you know, I thought the same thing, so The Devil All the Time is a 7 out of 10.
Delusions! Blaspheming the Lord in your mind and in your heart for some wrong done to you by another person.